It did not start yet. There it is. Today's presentation is going to be Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management. So the question is what is the Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management? And here on the welcome screen, it's an end-to-end visibility for your clusters and your applications that you want to deploy with ACM. It's full cluster lifecycle. So if you choose to build, destroy, and perform any additional tasks like deploying operators and such, you can do that from this console as well. The application lifecycle is kind of tied into doing. You can do much more than much more than just deploying applications to your different clusters. You can actually control the way that your clusters get configured and maintain that state. Governance, risk, and compliance. We'll touch a little bit on that. One of the other guys was actually doing a zero trust demo, and he left some of the stuff that was set up for his demo is still there. Could you zoom in a bit? Sure. How's that look?
Looks good to me.
All right. So with that being said, and the four different topics, we'll start in the overview. The overview gives you what your clusters are doing at any given moment, right? So if you deploy or even import your clusters with ACM, it'll give you this overview and kind of give you an idea of what's going on in your cluster. How many applications you've deployed, how many clusters you've got attached to your ACM, the different regions that you're in. This particular one is across AWS East, AWS East 2, and AWS West. The number of nodes that you've actually got assigned to all of your clusters and the pods that are running on those clusters. It also gives you, if you have the cluster compliance pieces installed, it'll bring back and tell you, give you kind of a snapshot of how that particular cluster is going, right? It also will tell you if you have issues with your clusters. This is tied back into insights. All right. So let's take a look at the clusters themselves. This particular ACM node is in control of 3 other clusters. So in that previous screen, you saw that it had 4 clusters. That cluster count includes the local cluster or the ACM cluster. And we structured our clusters in very much the same way that most of our customers structure their clusters. So we've got a dev test, a non-prod, and a prod. We do deliveries based off of, or deployments based off of these labels, right? So you'll see a cluster dev test, environment dev test, and you can also use any of these other labels to actually make your application deployments. And we'll go through an operator deployment here in just 1 minute, or a couple minutes, maybe not one. And each one of these, with the exception of the local clusters, we don't generally deploy anything other than management or infrastructure type applications to the ACM cluster. It's strictly a management piece. Like I was saying, that we have name non-prod, cluster non-prod, environment non-prod, and those are all given to it because not everybody deploys their applications the same or has the same structure in their deployment method. So whenever I make my deployments to the environments, I will specify the environment non-prod. A couple of our application developers like to use the cluster names And then we have a couple that like to use the different regions if they want their failover process, failover piece that they're working on. And they'll use the regions for that, right? So inside of here, all these clusters, with the exception of the local cluster or ACM, were created from ACM. To do that, you would go into your create cluster and tell it what infrastructure provider you wanted to use, right? You will select a credential. Ours are all on AWS, so we're using AWS credentials. You input the cluster name, the cluster set, if you want to assign a cluster set, and you can group clusters with the sets. So say you have several that are in AWS East or several that are assigned to a prod cluster, you can group those clusters and the changes that you assign to that cluster set will affect all of them. You would give it your release image, whether you wanted 4.9 or 4.10, 4.8, so on and so forth, and any additional labels that you wanted. Just like every other installer, you would pick your how many master nodes and where you wanted them to ride at, your worker pools, how many workers, the node count, size of the disks, networking, automation. I have not had a chance to get into this Ansible automation or templating as of yet. The one thing that I did want to bring to your attention is this YAML on and off button, right? So right here, it will show you the cluster YAML. There's also a grayed out button here, right? This install config. So say you wanted to do a UPI install or something to that effect, or you wanted to add additional trust bundles, or you wanted to add the different networking pieces, FIPS would go in here, right? Those options that weren't present in this main option, you can add those to this install config, and it will put them as a base 64 encoded install config. Where you go? Down here, right? You cannot manipulate this. It will override it as soon as you click go. It will override it if you haven't specified it in here. And that comes from experience. So that's one aspect of it. You can also do bare metal. As this is out in the cloud, I don't have any bare metal assets, but you can do very much the same thing. And you go through there and you click and tell it what you want, and then you create, right? Unfortunately, we don't have anything to show you on that. This is the automation portion. Like I said, I haven't actually gotten to look or to even investigate into this Ansible automation piece. We do have Tower, and I'm working my way to getting there, but it just hasn't happened yet. We're going to move on to the application set. So you say, what can you do with ACM? ACM is a super cool tool, and anything that you specify in your applications and anything that you can templateize or put in customize or anything like that, you can get ACM to deploy it for you. And based off of those node labels or the cluster labels, you can have it deploy that resource to that specific cluster or a bunch of clusters. This cluster config here, and I guess I should point this out. So everything that you do inside of the applications is considered part of the CI/CD process, right? So if you notice over here, it says resource. Where is it getting it from? Everything comes from Git, right? So this is part of one of the other guys' Zero Trust demos, right? And it comes out of the cluster config hub. Let me flip over here. So none of the stuff that I'm actually going to do here in a second. I'll do the OLL operator deploy, the operator logging, OpenShift logging operator here in just a second. Where did that go? Cluster config hub. All right. So everything he deployed out of there came out of this CI/CD lifecycle, right? So that's how that all ties back, right? First off, it keeps all of your code to where multiple people can look at it and make contributions to it. Number two, it will periodically go out and get any information from the Git repository. So if you go in there and make a commit and it's different than what it has here in the cluster deploy, it will actually go out there and update and then modify your application. All right. So while we're in here talking about the applications, let's go ahead and talk about what it is, right? So this high level here is the application itself, right? And that's tied back to the Git. Then you also have the subscription, and that's very much like a subscription for an operator. This kind of follows that same template. And then below that, you have your placement rules, right? Where did you want it to go, right? Your hub cluster, your why hasn't it showed me anything different than the hub cluster? Thinks prod is offline. Well, that's fancy. Here we go. Nope, that's not it either. Anywho, so it will give you exactly what and where each one of these subscriptions landed and how it got there, right? You can look at any one of these resources that you've got in here. So if there's a problem with the deployment or something to that effect, you can go over and you can look at the YAML, and just like everything else, if there's an issue with it, you have a status down here, and it will start to show you, right? Give you pointers back to what is actually happening. All right. So let's go and let's deploy an application real time, right? And you don't have to use the UI. Everything that you can do in here, you can do through the CLI as well, right? So I told you I was going to do an OLL deploy, and that OLL deploy comes right out of our Git, right? Nothing super fancy, but it does take the the OpenShift logging operator, and it will make that deployment to whatever cluster I choose, right? So this is our repository that we're going to work out of. And that's what I'm going to point it to whenever I use the Git, right? All right. And then we tell it where we want to go. I think it's out of the admin repo. I'll make sure here before we get too far. Admin repo. And then we will need to have this here. Is everybody following right now? Yep. Okay.
Personally, I'm pretty impressed with this product. I've never seen this, so this is really cool.
All right. So, and this OLO operator is just, here I am talking, and is just an example, right? So this follows any CI/CD process that you want to have that's out there. right? So as we come down, configure automation, pre-hook, post-hook. If you want to have other things happen before or after you make this deployment, it'll do so. The disable auto reconciliation. So that reconciliation is the part about where it's going out, and it communicates back with Git and says, "Is there any changes?" Git says there's no changes, then nothing happens. If Git does say that there's a change or there's that hook in there, and then it will affect a new change to your environment. Let's do this to prod, right? Because everybody needs logging in prod. You can tell it to deploy to online clusters and local cluster. I do not do that because most everything that we deploy has absolutely no reason to be on the ACM cluster. However, when you'll see banners on our clusters, this banner up here, that did go out to all of our clusters, right? Based off of their label. Deploying a local cluster, that would deploy it here to the ACM, right? So, but we're going to keep it with environment equals prod, right? You can also add another repository if you have a fancier application that has multiple repositories, or say there's a database backend that has a repository, and your web front end has its own repository. You can add those, and it will combine it as a single application, right? You can look at the YAML as you're deploying it, right? It goes through and it selects the names, or creates the namespace for you, does the subscription for you, ACM channel main for the subscription, and it creates the placement rule. And our particular placement is environment equals prod, right? Okay, so I think we're ready to go. We'll give it one last look. All right. So it'll sit here for a second until it redirects us and says, "Hey, we're ready to deploy." Oh. Maybe I can't be that zoomed in. All right. So as you've seen, as the cluster was deploying, it picked up the subscription, the placements, put it on the cluster prod, right? It opened up the operator group for the subscription for the OpenShift logging operator. It also picked out the Elasticsearch operator, cluster logging instance, created the namespace for OpenShift logging, the namespace for OpenShift operators, Red Hat, and so on. So everything's got little green check marks. Means that everything went through okay, right? And then you say, well, did it really deploy over there? We ask ourselves that all the time, right? So now I'm on my prod cluster, right, where I placed it, right? You didn't see me do anything fancy, did you? I didn't go over there and do any kind of crazy deploys. Here's our namespace, right? This is not a full, it deployed the operator, but I do not have it create any instances, right? So here's the operator that we just deployed. There are no logging instances because I have no endpoints to log to. So the goal here was just to deploy the operator, right? Not to do the instance, and to demonstrate the capability of what ACM can do for you without having to make a bunch of point and clicks or a bunch of customizations or anything like that, right? All right. Man, this is a quiet bunch. Are there any questions up to this point?
Yeah, I got one. So if I deploy an application at the cluster level instead of from ACM, will ACM still take that application up that was deployed, or does it have to go through ACM?
It'll have to go through ACM.
Okay.
Or in here in the applications area, you'll only see the ones that we've actually deployed through ACM. And there's a bunch of other things. There's a bunch of other things in the prod cluster. Or maybe not anymore. Yeah, prod, RHACM, stack rocks. So this one was deployed via ACM, the stack rocks. So you'll see him in here. Well, that's not handy. Maybe it didn't go through and do any kind of cleanup. All right.
So Ray, not a question. I really appreciate this. Learned a lot, but I just want to point out. So I'm actually going through this right now, and I was able to get it to work successfully, importing and managing pre-existing clusters. So that's a pretty nifty feature. If anybody has any clusters, prior to actually obtaining, well, actually, that is a question. Is this separate? This is separate subs, I imagine, right?
Separate subs for what?
So like for the customer, would they have to purchase this outside of OpenShift?
It depends.
I do believe that the ACM is part of like the Premium Plus or whatever they're calling that stuff.
Okay.
Yep.
The Cloud Plus or
Plus. It's included.
There it is.
Okay. So yeah, so you would click that import cluster, and you would enter the credentials and everything, and it will generate. You can select, I think, run right in there, run import commands manually. It generates this massive, and I mean massive, base64 encrypted command, and you log into the cluster on the command line, and all you got to do, you can do the kube config method, but this is the route that I took. Was it generates this massive command, even gives you the capability of it auto copying it to your clipboard. You run that in the cluster, and it generates the cluster. And then I've also used, I don't know if anybody works in any disconnected environments, but I just successfully got the governance. I created governances to generate the content source, the image content source policies, and push that across all of the clusters. So it pushes those configurations like we were talking about earlier, Ray. It pushes that and makes all of the clusters consistent so that you're pointing all your clusters to the same disconnected source for your updates. And and it works real great. So I mean, I'm still working on it, but it seems to work real great in tandem with the oh gosh, what's it called?
We'll get to the security governance here in just a little bit.
Yeah, the OpenShift update service operator, which is kind of essentially mirrors or mimics the update process or source of a connected environment. So you use that in combination with this, and it works really well to push those updates to your clusters. And I'm sorry, I had to shoo off a kid here, but did you have you covered how to do the updates?
No.
Okay.
All my clusters are all connected. If you did want to do the cluster update, the only thing that you would have to do is go into your clusters and click the upgrade.
Awesome.
And it will upgrade them. It'll give you the option of where you want it to go, and then you can click upgrade and it'll go out there. Now, the one thing so the communication between these clusters is at a very high level, right? So you'll want to think about how you want, you don't necessarily want to use kubeadmin, but you might want to use a different account, right? That has cluster administrator privileges in there, because it will continuously talk back and forth between these individual clusters. let's go back to the applications. So I did want to point out, so I went ahead and I clicked the delete for the application. It's no longer showing up there, right? If you come over here to installed operators, and this is on my prod cluster, it did get rid of the Elasticsearch, and it got rid of the OpenShift logging operator. However, it doesn't necessarily clean up the namespaces, right? Because he still remains. So I just wanted to bring that out as, you know, it does do certain things, but it doesn't do necessarily clean up, right? So you might have a bunch of orphan namespaces in here if you don't go in and do a little bit of cleanup, right? So just terminating that particular namespace, got rid of it, and now everything's gone, right, for the OpenShift logging operator. Let's see. All right. One thing that I kind of glossed over is the credentials. There are a couple different places that you put in credentials. One being for the applications. You could have a set of credentials for your Git. That's why you didn't see me enter in a user ID or a password for the Git, because we already have that set of credentials in there. And then the second set of credentials you can have are the actual cluster credentials themselves, right? So this particular credential has our AWS credentials attached to it, and you can pretty much add, delete, destroy whatever you want to in there. Let's go back to governance. So these are all based off of policies. We'll go back to the applications for just 1 second. And I can't remember which one of these is the actual policy one, or if that was something that was left over. I can't remember. But anyways, you can deploy these via policies, and you can also tie them to the compliance operators and other things like that, right? And it gives you a pretty little view here, and you can flip back to cluster violations and policies. So one of the policy limits that we set up as kind of a default was limit cluster admin, right? So just because it comes up with an exclamation mark doesn't necessarily mean all of your clusters are out. It just means that maybe one of your clusters is out, right? So dev, test, and prod, they're okay. And your non-compliant cluster is local, right? Because we don't want anybody logging in there. So I would label that as an okay policy to have in there, right? Disallowed roles, right? The particular disallowed roles for this are going to be dev test and local clusters as well, right? You can go ahead and edit the policy if you want, right? You can edit the YAML. This happens to come out of the NIST SP 800-53, right? And you can get that pretty little, page that tells you what's in and what's out. And you can tie that back into the compliance operators and stuff like that. And then you can get the information about all that. I don't really delve too deeply into the security aspect of things. We've got one of our other consultants is actually doing the policies and enforcement pieces. If you did want to do something like that, there is a good Red Hat has a set of policies. They're supported. come out of our policy collections. Yeah, this is it. And you can set this up and it will actually go out and make a deployment for your policies and then put your compliance operator on it and whatnot. But these come out of the stable for the ACM. And it tells you everything, how to do that. What else am I missing? What else haven't I touched on? Well, cluster.
I know you said you haven't dabbled in the automation piece, but one question did come up. When you go into automation, at least in the version we're looking in of ACM, it talks about adding a tower operator or a advanced automation operator, but then under credentials, it allows you to enter credentials for an external tower source. So I'm just curious, can it be one or the other? Do you need the operator to actually still reach out to the external source?
No idea.
Like you see right there at the top, it says, yeah, to use this feature, the Ansible automation platform resource operator must be installed. However, why in credentials is there if you were to go there, there's a subsection to add credentials to an external automation platform? Like why is it required if you can still authenticate externally?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd say if you wanted an answer to that, you should reach out to the ACM chat channel and post that question. I don't know.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's go back to the welcome screen and make sure I kind of touched on everything. The end-to-end visibility was under the overview. Cluster lifecycle, you saw how to update, you destroy, create. Application lifecycle, we deployed the operator and the governance, risk, and compliance. We touched on as the policies that were in there. Getting this thing up and going isn't that much of an issue. However, in your environments, there is a little bit of thought process that has to go into it. And the couple of sites that we've interacted with that have actually made this a thing have used it as an infrastructure or management piece, and they don't install it on the actual clusters themselves. That way they can manage them, being that this particular cluster would actually have access out to your vCenter environment or AWS or your bare metal pieces. They keep that in their infrastructure or management areas. And with that, I think my topic is pretty much done. Open it back up for questions.
So I do have a question about just, I'm thinking from like OpenShift in general, like, you know, you have like an admin view, a developer view. Is there like an equivalent in cluster management, or is there like you know, like a view only mode, that kind of stuff? Like, I don't know what kind of options there are for the user management.
Those are all RBAC.
Okay, I was just curious because you didn't touch on it, and I assumed it was something like that, but I didn't know.
Yeah, there are some things like whenever you're creating the high-level subscriptions and stuff like that, where you'll need to have a cluster role or attached to your account or a group account. Like ours are set for cluster role admin, with my first initial last name with a -admin. And it comes out of that particular group. So everything that we do is attached to those groups. But yeah, it's all, from my understanding, all the RBAC is all set up for groups and users. However, because it is an infrastructure piece, we don't typically let developers into ACM. I've primarily used it as a infrastructure piece, deploying operators, modifying machine configs, stuff like that. So in general, from my perspective, there's no reason for an application developer to be in there. But I guess you can assign read-only. Any other questions?
I apologize if you covered it already, but can you tie it into the compliance operator, the governance, or is it a lateral shift? Like all of your policies and profiles and everything that you've already completed all your remediation, everything that you might have done in compliance operator, does it work in tandem with it, or is it separate from?
No, I think that you could bring back those compliance pieces, right? So if you deploy the ACS, advanced cluster security, and then the compliance pieces, and then I think that there's a tie back to ACM for that. Don't quote me on that. I haven't actually done that, but I do believe that there is pieces that come back into ACM.
Awesome, sweet. And is there an ACM? I'm assuming there is ACM chat or Teams room.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to look for that as well. Really appreciate this. Very helpful.
Yeah. No problem. Got any other questions? Otherwise, I'll just open it up for group chat. No. Okay. Gary, Keith, I'm passing it back over to you. And we can have 20 minutes back.
All righty, man. I appreciate you coming and talking to us about ACM, man.
Yeah.
Let me get this recording stopped.